AI. Like some of you might already know, we are a monthly meetup group. We bring awesome leaders in AI to talk about ethics, biases, and in general, a lot of different topics around artificial intelligence. So today we have Peter Thames from Seattle. He's actually the founder and president of the Institute of Innovation in Large Organizations, ILO in short. I will post in comments and chat section his LinkedIn profile so you can connect directly. Um, Besides being the founder and president at ILO, Peter is also involved with Accenture, NASA, and lots of amazing organizations helping their leadership and innovation strategies. So, without further ado, I won't come in the way of interacting with Peter. So, Peter, over to you. Thank you for being here.
That's great, Vikram. Thank you, and it's a privilege to be with you. I thought what I would do today is speak first and foremost to this large issue about algorithmic bias, but with an intent to connect it to the times that we're living through. I mean, it's April 2021. The social sphere, the culture in the United States has been changing in some very, very important ways. We just had the verdict in the Derek Chauvin case around the killing of George Floyd. And, many people have been relieved that based on what we all saw from the digital media of the social media clip of the terrible experience that led to the end of the life of George Floyd, that because this officer who killed him, in some sense, while we were all watching, because he was found guilty on all 3 counts he was tried for, I think there's a feeling of relief that we didn't have the catastrophic reaction that might have followed had he not been found guilty. But more than this, when we look at policing, when we look at the way that we make decisions about who is dangerous and who is not, we have this extraordinary range of American social history coming to bear. And that relates quite directly to what we talk about when we talk about this idea of algorithmic bias. So I'm going to try to connect the dots a little bit, and by all means, let's share some questions, and I'll share whatever thoughts and response I can, and perhaps we can really have some kind of a dialogue here. So I have a problem, frankly, even with the phrase algorithmic bias, right? The challenge I have there is the algorithms that we build as part of a machine learning process that plugs into artificial intelligence. The algorithms may be, poorly done or well done, but what most of us mean when we use that phrase algorithmic bias is really not that the algorithms are biased. It's not that we're saying, hey, show me this data set of people who've been arrested, but because I'm a biased algorithm, let's emphasize the people of color. It's not that. It's building usually a pretty good algorithm that says, let's look at all the people who've been arrested and make some decisions about, for example, who should get a mortgage or who should be let out on bail if they've been arrested. And the data sets that we look at with these pretty good algorithms themselves are generally more or less accurate pools of data from a society, from a history that is riven with bias, which is to say, I grew up as a white kid in New York City, went to the public schools. The 1970s and early 80s were the times that I was doing things that might have led to very bad outcomes, made my mother very upset. I was arrested 0 times. I was stopped by police several times. I was not perceived as a threat to the extent I probably would have been. A, had I been a person of color, or B, had I lived in a neighborhood that had been identified as a high crime neighborhood. So now if you take the data set and say, okay, we're looking at college scholarships. We're hiring for certain kinds of jobs. We're looking at a pool of young men who've gotten into trouble, and we're deciding which ones are worthwhile for us to really devote the resources and the force to locking up or somehow moving over here out of the mainstream because we want to protect society from them. With the same actions, I was quite likely put in a pool of folks who were less harshly treated, who had fewer options or no options foreclosed. The point is that we have a social bias and institutional bias, the kinds of structural bias that aren't about let's have an algorithm that's biased and puts a thumb on the scale, and that are more about having a clean algorithm that gives you an accurate picture of a data set which is shaped by these institutional challenges. I'll give you a very specific example. Sometime in the next 20 years, we're likely to have police officers, when they pull a service weapon, have at the tip of the spear there, right at the end of that weapon, have a camera that connects to some really robust facial recognition software. Now, one of the reasons you have this is because of some of the challenges that are present in some classic training exercise. Classic training exercise for a new policeman involves a video screen, and you have a shoot or don't shoot exercise. So you're the training officer. You're there with your pistol. You're in front of this big screen. It's like a golf simulator, if you've ever done that kind of thing. And you see someone at the distance. There's a street, and 100 yards away, there's a fellow dressed in black slowly walking towards you. The scenario is there's been a 911 call, dangerous or suspicious man walking around. Maybe he has a gun. And you approach, he approaches you, and you say, stop, right? You're the officer in training. And in this scenario, you call out, halt, stop, police. And this potential suspect, as he approaches you, makes hand gestures like this. Like, now, what does that mean? I think it means it's okay, but it may mean something else. He keeps coming toward you, and you say, halt, stop, this is an order, this is the police. And typically you'll put your hand on your weapon. He keeps coming. You pull your weapon, you point it, and you say, stop. You say loudly, with intensity, stop. And he doesn't stop. He just makes that gesture. And then he reaches behind him and pulls out something that fills his hand. It's dark in color, and it's moving toward you. What do you do? So the training exercise has the surprise ending. Maybe you, the training officer, shoot. Maybe you don't. The surprise ending is he's pulling out a wallet that folds down with a sign that says, I am deaf. I think it's a pretty good training exercise. It's a training exercise intended to have new young officers learn to think more before they shoot. Learn to think less that they're embattled and less that they're warriors and more that they're guardians, more that they're protectors. Good values built into some assumptions there. But what if you had at the tip of that gun the facial recognition that allowed you to, if you pointed your weapon at anyone, to give you what we call a hepatic signal, right? A physical sensation that gives you information. It vibrates if the face you're looking at is recognized as someone who is deaf. And you as an officer now have that information. Or it vibrates differently, or makes a sound, or gives a verbal signal that says this is a law enforcement officer. Boy, you're probably going to react differently. Or it gives you a signal that says this is a convicted criminal. This is a violent felon. But again, who gets convicted? Who's in that category? We know through the history of law enforcement in the United States, there's been plenty of bias, which isn't to say that today in a given time, in a given place, this officer is bad. It's not to say that our criminal justice system is thoroughly broken, but it is to say that we know for sure that there has been a tremendous history in bias, beginning with the slave trade, beginning with slave laws, beginning with slave patrols in this country. And the bias in our culture has created a history that these pools of data now reflect. The bias is generally not in the algorithms, which is why I'm not crazy about that phrase, algorithmic bias. The bias isn't really in the data. The data is telling the story of the residue of centuries of often cruel bias. And it's not simply about race, it's also about gender, It's about social class. It's a very complicated but extraordinarily important challenge for us to have to face. And one of the reasons it's so important is because of the rapid development of all kinds of data-driven things, like data-driven sentencing in criminal courts. And it's worth taking a moment to talk about data-driven sentencing. It was about 4 years ago, the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, John Roberts, was the keynote speaker for a talk at Rochester Institute of Technology, very, very good school. The president of that school introducing, the distinguished guest, African-American woman, a great scholar, told her audience, hey, we need to pay special attention as engineers, right? RIT, Institute of Technology, to this fella, to our leader nationally of our highest judicial body, who is also the CEO of all the federal courts in the United States. We need to listen to him because we will soon be in an era in which young men and women and old men and women will be sentenced to different terms by sentencing algorithms, by data-driven AI systems. Roberts climbs the stage, shakes her hand, thanks her, and then says, this is a profoundly important way to introduce me. Thank you. But it is incorrect. We will not soon be in that environment. We are in it today. And part of what he's talking about is not so much that federal courts are sentencing people with relevance to these databases and these sentencing algorithms, but there are two large companies that make a lot of money by generating sentencing algorithms, sentencing recommendations based on algorithms, based on propensity for someone to commit more crime, which is to say, when this young person, and typically it's a young male, and more likely than not, or at least we should say disproportionately likely, it's a young male of color who's been arrested, and there's a certain degree of judicial discretion in what the sentence will be. Should we say, kid, you made a mistake? You've been treated rough in the last month kicking around the county courthouse? Maybe that's enough. Don't you dare do it again. Do we say, you're clearly a danger to society. We're going to sentence you now to the high end of the sentencing range for this crime, or we're going to do something else. The federal courts don't rely on these very much at all. And depending on the perspective you share, you may think that there are actually federal laws that make that something we're not able to rely on, though it's probably happening on the fringe. The local courts are where this is really happening. You see municipal courts, right? The small city level. You see county courts, a little bit at the state level, depending on the state. Some states explicitly outlaw it. Some have, loose policies or no policies. But this is happening in thousands of jurisdictions, areas in which, for example, someone who's arrested for a criminal complaint is not likely to face a jury and not likely even to face a judge. And you may know that about 95% of all criminal charges in the United States are adjudicated through a plea agreement, which means you're poor, you get arrested, and chances are you've done what you're accused of or something pretty close to it. You're given a public defender. The public defender doesn't really know you, doesn't really take a lot of time with you. The judge whose docket your case falls on has 20 times the number of cases he or she could plausibly hear. So the prosecutor looks at the case in not a lot of time, usually minutes, not hours, and says, here's the deal. Let's get this one done. Let's sign it and be done. And that prosecutor is going to say something like, 30 days, 90 days, a year, 5 years. Admit that you've done it. Plead guilty, and we're done. And it takes minutes and not hours, and not days and not months. It's a terrible, terrible system. Arguably, it's explicitly unconstitutional, but that's the way a lot of justice is done, especially at the local level. What that prosecutor is often looking at, and if it gets in front of a judge, what the judge is often looking at, is what one of these two large sentencing algorithm companies will spit out as a recommendation. This person, likely a young person of color, ought not to be sentenced to the lower range in the punishment scale, but the higher, or not the higher, but the lower, because we know statistically, based on the data we have, that he, and it's most likely a he, is more likely than not to commit another crime in the next couple of years. Is more likely than not to not repay bail if we agree to bail. Is more likely than not to associate with other violent criminals. On the basis of what? On the basis of what zip code you live in, as one salient example. In many cases, you're not granted bail, you're not given a shorter versus a longer sentence because you live in a zip code with lots of other convicted felons. Perhaps you live in a household with other convicted felons. But because arrests for the same acts and sentencing for the same guilty plea tend to be higher for people of color, because the zip code you live in today, when if you have enough money in your pocket, you might be able to choose to live somewhere else, but perhaps your parents or your grandparents didn't have that option when redlining was the rule rather than the exception. Those places you live become part of these algorithms. The algorithms are likely to be accurate, but they're accurate snapshots of the residue of openly racist, openly discriminatory, terribly slanted cultures and practices, often explicitly engineered by government agencies at every different level. So the challenge is, what do we do? If any of us in this discussion are in the business of building systems like this, or in the business of building tools that help parse very large amounts of data, or taking that data and turning them into machine learning approaches and turning them into systems that now have some actionable principles for how to make decisions like sentencing, how to make decisions like jail or bail, or how to make decisions like signal that this guy is dangerous when you're pointing a gun at him. How do we address it? And I'll just offer a couple of quick thoughts. Number one, it is a terrible mistake to say that because the data is biased, we should take the algorithm, which generally we presume is seeking to give an honest answer to a straightforward question, even if that honest answer speaks the language of bias as the data does. It's a terrible thing to say to the algorithm, put a thumb on the scale. When dealing with a person of color, when dealing with certain zip codes, don't answer the question straight up, answer the question with a counter bias intended to correct the bias that comes from the data. When we're unable to get a straightforward answer to a straightforward question, we're doomed. The notion that we are wise enough to put a bias in the system that will counteract the biases already built in there is a foolish notion. I believe history has shown that pretty clearly. Instead, we need to do two things. We need more data. We need to be able to say, yeah, here's the data about this zip code, and now here's data as well that should be readable about who lives there and why, how they got there, what the social context has been, what the measurable known bias has been, what other bias we can impute based on other data, so that the answer isn't 6 months, the answer is 6 months, and yet ask judge these additional questions. 6 months, if we believe the system was fair, here's the list of reasons the system might not have been fair. The more data that we can put in these systems while keeping the algorithms honest, while taking algorithms that we presume are built to be relatively straightforward and strengthening that straightforward quality, that gives us reliability, strength, trust. And we can say, of course, when you point the honest camera at the ugly fact, you have an ugly picture, it is wrong to change the camera so the ugly fact looks prettier, right? I think it's extremely important to do that. So you don't want that bias. You don't want to put your thumb on the scale, because then the question is, who among us is the great judge of how heavy the thumb hits? And how can we pretend that the system is more honest than it really is? Let us be appropriately skeptical about this whole system with decent algorithms pointed to data that tells the story about past bias, past corruption, past oppression. That's very, very important. Beyond that, I think we have some larger questions when we look at building data sets, building algorithms, and looking at reports. that get to the question of what the larger purpose of these systems are. So, when you look at organizations that are able, as technology-driven organizations, to clarify their purpose and to build in what we look at as an ethical layer in the technology stack, right? Where you're going to say, hey, we want to ask very profound, important, and technically sophisticated questions about certain kinds of outcomes. That's why we're building some good AI systems with good algorithms with great access to very large pools of data. Certain activities and certain answers aren't what we're looking for. For example, we want to begin with, and the Gates Foundation is very good about this, the notion that all human life is equally important. So that means when we ask questions like, what's the next dollar that we can spend to save the most number of lives, you're going to wind up with relatively few answers that look like, let's cure this disease, let's create a vaccine, let's create this or that, when in fact, so much has been cured already but can't get to where folks are. A large enough pool of data answers the critical functional question, but within the boundaries of these very important ethical principles, like all lives being equally precious, and you get answers more like, let's build more roads, let's focus more on distribution, let's focus on anti-corruption activities, so that, for example, clean water, which is pervasive where you have good government, which is moved across highway networks and pulled from the ground when you don't have the thumb on the scale of the corrupt government, of the militias at roadblocks, of the folks who siphon off the goods that are given to support large populations in crisis because it's profitable for that thin layer of the population who can abuse the generosity of others who are far away. You wind up needing to inevitably making better policies, doing less sexy work, and by no means is creating vaccines against virus something we should tut about, but it's not as often the right answer as focus more on the logistics of getting the vaccines already invented to the folks who don't have access, and we're living through that even in the United States right now, and certainly much of the rest of the world. And having access to technology already invented, already proven, not necessarily terribly expensive, but within a social structure that can be sustainable for people. The clarity of saying this human ethics layer, this values layer of the technology stack that says this is why, this is what our endeavors are for. This is the human flourishing that these technology tools are built to support. To make that clear brings an extraordinarily more efficient technological focus as you build the stack further. So those are a range of thoughts. I think let me pause here and see if we have any questions, more comments, or declarations that are way off base. Make sure I can see the chat. Vikram, I don't know if you want an intervention here or some guidance. I think your audio is off, Vikram.
Yeah, no, I was just monitoring all the other streams and just sharing with people that this is a session that if you want, you can participate live. So we have a few more folks here. Any questions, comments from anyone? Definitely, Peter, what you shared, it kind of resonates with the mindset that a lot of us have here. We've been meeting for the last 3 years now, and over 6,000 members between 2-3 different groups. And I think the thought that you shared around just using the technology and data in the right way, and if you can contribute, especially things which are much needed globally by everyone, no matter what, where they are, which country, and the access to technology or wealth or not, such as vaccine. It is so important that some technologies be shared across. And it was good to see that at least at some level the data is being shared across by countries and even companies, so they can stay ahead of the virus. But yeah, there is some really good examples like that from technological collaboration where people come together to solve a common problem and or do good for the greater good of humanity. I think that message is very well received by, I'm sure, a lot of others. I'm just reading the reactions across multiple channels. So, thank you for sharing this. Anyone else wants to share or ask a question? I can bring you to stage, or there should be a raise hand option on your right hand side panel. I can just invite you to the stage. And if you're joined on a mobile device, I think that there's a limited option, so I can't invite you to a stage if you are on the mobile device. So I see few attendees were on mobile, so I couldn't get them to the stage. Yeah, we have Kirtan. Hi.
Hello. Yeah, everything sounded accurate. We definitely need more of a focus on. It sounds like the ethical framework you're describing is something similar to one that one of my colleagues put into our primary focus, where you take the value of life very seriously and you try to build effective solutions for improving the world in ways that are practical. So I often look at effective altruism, where you're not just trying to, okay, I'm going to throw $10,000 at the problem. Well, no, it depends on how effective the method you're funding is.
Right.
And a lot of people tend to forget that. I didn't actually know that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation had that same sort of mentality behind what they do.
Yeah, no, they do it, and I think it's quite admirable. There's a very, very interesting writer named Ivan Illich, who was especially active in the 60s and 70s, who wrote a book called Deschooling Society. One of the first things he said in that book, and he's written across a lot of topics, was we tend to confuse treatment with cure. And that's very important. I think that should also be especially appealing to technologists who tend to be fairly hard-headed people. And part of what I take that to mean is we tend to confuse lots of energy in the teaching of things for the effective learning of things. We tend to confuse lots of effort to try doing things with observing that they've gotten done. And when you look, for example, going back to the core ethics questions around not just AI, but the end use of technologies, you have these great mRNA vaccines, which are, in some sense, pure technology projects. And then you say, okay, in Seattle, where I live, and in much of the world, we know there are disparities in how people of color and people who have less remunerative jobs, people who are in the service industries, have been impacted by COVID. And I think it's quite measurable that here in Seattle, because of some extraordinarily well-intended efforts to reserve a large number of doses, priority delivering to the color to communities of people of color, we had a net slowing down of the total number of people vaccinated. So, the thought experiment is, okay, if you've got 1,000 people living in a certain community who are more exposed to COVID because of the work they do, which is itself a function to some degree of social discrimination over generations. And if they're as likely to die or to be ill from COVID because of their exposure to people whom they serve, whom they encounter, because they're delivering the packages, they're the medical technicians cleaning the beds. If we slow down the net delivery of vaccine doses so they get more first, but fewer people overall are vaccinated by a given day, are they in the end having more illness rather than less? From the numbers that I've seen, the answer is for a brief period of time, yes, there probably were more deaths and more illness among people of color in the city of Seattle because of these extraordinarily well-intended efforts to reserve more doses for people of color to be vaccinated, which led to too many doses sitting on a shelf, especially overnight, day after day after day for a couple of weeks at least, which led to more people, white and black, having the disease and encountering service workers who are more likely to be people of color and more of those service workers getting COVID. We want to do the good thing. We want to prioritize protection and, again, put a thumb on the scale to help rebalance the bias built into the system. And that's the treatment. We want to do more treatment. It feels right. But without that hard-headed sense of, is this the best way to protect more people of color or not, without doing that in a hard-headed way, we tend to do less good. And it takes a certain amount, I think, of unsentimental commitment to outcomes, and even as those outcomes are intended to be, specifically directed towards certain folks within culture, it's harder to do than we tend to think. And it's harder to focus on, the learning rather than teaching, the cure rather than the treatment. I see a question from, I think Deborah might be wanting to speak as well.
Hey. Hi, Vikram. Hi, Peter. Is my mic live?
Yes.
I hear you.
Okay. Yeah, so since I've worked for tech companies most of my adult life, I'm wondering how you're seeing some companies kind of combine the whole idea of ethics with the technical side of things.
Yeah.
Do you see companies that are pairing it together as they're developing AI tools, that they're from the ground up, they're building in ethical principles?
So more and more, yes. And, my institute has led some efforts in the book that we published about a year ago, along with Accenture, was part of an effort to bring people together from a lot of the large tech companies and the government to have exactly this conversation. Talk about what that ethical layer is. Talk about how we can define within our systems that there are higher priorities for generalized AI than a narrow technical task or, an accomplishment of duty task. And those are about impact on human society, right? The example that always struck me was reading about a new city in China being built from the ground up that would have 300,000 or 400,000 people living in a pure smart city environment, which, as announced by a provisional government, had as its highest priority carbon neutral impact, zero environmental degradation every day. And, if you really think that through, if they're serious, if you have all these interlocking systems that are working with great AI without a lot of human intervention, and you say number one goal, protect the environment, inevitably, the water quality and the soil quality monitoring systems are going to talk to the HVAC system and say, dude, cut off the air for those humans. They're killing the environment. So if you articulate the wrong highest good, like no environmental impact, you might wind up killing all the humans in order to get there. You have to articulate the human flourishing as the highest good. Because that's what we'll agree on. So I do see far more effort today than, let's say, 3 years ago when we began addressing this as what we thought was a critical issue. I would say that more importantly, the question of who's in the room is really vital. And this goes right back to what we mean by inclusion and diversity. As we did a lot of the work around this project I mentioned that led to the We the People book, the phrase human flourishing came up. It's not something that we put up as an institute, but it was part of the conversation, and we kind of captured it and said this is a principal purpose of what these systems are about, what technology and what government and what society are for, to support more human flourishing. It's a great phrase, and human is intentionally inclusive, right? So when we say we want flourishing of the creators, of the people who've demonstrated a certain amount of attainment, we can hear how unkind and inappropriate that is. We want the flourishing of everybody. As soon as we use that language and then we start looking at our organizations and we look at our cultures and communities, I think we realize we still have the legacies of these very explicitly, intentionally discriminatory systems with us. And pulling people in, making sure that our boards and our executives and our technologists include people from every background is just such an imperative. And you can feel, I think, in most large organizations, that that's becoming more and more vital. And, you know, it's extraordinary. I mean, I've been doing this stuff. My background as an academic came out of the study of literature and ethics and culture and religion. And I spent, you know, I'm now 55. I spent much of my 20s and 30s studying the American Civil Rights Movement. What we're living through today in terms of advancement and inclusion and attempts at equity is a very large step forward from where I sit. And I think based on what we know about how cultures work, it's tough, it's hard, but we're seeing some changes that are fundamental. The biggest leap culturally is that when we are going to be inclusive, we have to recognize that we're going to be different. And that's actually pretty hard. The old joke in education reform circles, and you know, for the last 20 years, education reform, which I've been very involved in, has been about let's make sure we get people who have been excluded to score higher on tests and have better, you know, attainment outcomes. If you go back to when I was a kid in the public schools of New York, education reform was more about let's give kids more freedom. But if you look at any attempt to give people more freedom and any attempt to be more inclusive, almost invariably it's, hey, let's give people more freedom and choice to choose to do exactly what we want. Let's have more inclusion and diversity to get people of all different backgrounds who are fundamentally still allowed. And it's that next step to say, as we really work hard to be more inclusive and to have more equity, our company's probably going to start going in some different directions with different outcomes. And we understand that, and we intend that, and we embrace that. That's the cusp, I think, that we're on right now.
Wow, that takes a level of humility from the founders of the company that I think is pretty uncommon.
It's interesting, right? Humility, ideally, when they do it because they believe it's right.
Yeah.
When they do it because they feel like if they don't do it, they're going to be squashed or left aside in the ash heap of history, they might still do it anyway.
There should be a few people feeling that with things going on in Europe.
Well, and elsewhere as well. You know, I was in a room about 2 years ago with, it was a very interesting room, and you know, I think had they really understood who I was, they might not have invited me. But it included a lot of people with the word ethics in their title from the big tech companies, including Facebook. And I was really struck by 2 or 3 people at Facebook who just said, hey, you know, just between us chickens here, we feel like we kind of put Donald Trump in the White House by accident. And we really don't want to do that again. And we're not sure we know how to not do that, right? We think we might be making too many of the same mistakes that we made before. And that kind of existential dread, right? Maybe we'll make even more money, but we'll be living in a society that we as individuals don't feel is a free society, or as a society that is marked by certain kinds of politics that we abhor. That had, I think, enormous change and pressure. And I got to take my hat off to Jack Dorsey. I mean, he was the first with Twitter to say we're going to take no political ads during the next political season a couple of years ago. And that cost him a lot of money. It cost him money personally. It cost his company. I think some of his decisions to exclude people from his platform who were advocating what he ultimately came to see and his colleagues came to see as existentially dangerous ideas, right? We believe in freedom of thought, but not, or I shouldn't say thought, we believe in freedom of expression on our platform, which is different from freedom of expression on whatever platform someone else wants to. We believe in freedom of expression on our platform, but not beyond the point at which it may really be killing many people or distorting some of the decency of our society. And it's not an easy thing to do. You can imagine the degree to which a guy like Dorsey, who already relies on a certain degree of cocooning just to be safe, if you've ever had personal relationships with people who are famous for being rich, among other things, their lives are foreclosed in some ways just because of the security that most of them need to have. I think that was very courageous. I respect it. And I hope we'll see more of that. That is digital ethics, right? That is just as important as how we put in an ethical layer in the building of a system so that it won't do things we don't want it to do. That human intervention and the human presence that is critical about what our systems and organizations do is something we can't ever give up.
So would it be fair to say that the ethical layer is still in the design phase?
So it's an interesting question, and I think I can interpret it a couple of different ways. Understanding how to have a good ethical layer is something that we're still figuring out, but I suspect we always will be. It's one of those things where there will be no single best practice because it's so responsive to the environment that we're in and to what technologies are and what technologies do. In the same way that you could build a typewriter that doesn't chop people's fingers off by accident. That's different from looking at the harm that can be done, by a smartphone in some ways. Looking at automobiles is really interesting. If you look at the political death match over seatbelts, which we now recognize as such an easy choice, and how do we not embrace it? You can see that the rise of a new technology, like the mass availability of automobiles, brought enormous gain, but some very sharp harm. And it took a long negotiation as a society to kind of begin to try to manage that. So we are certainly in the development phase in that sense. Today, of course, the question of automobile safety that we're racing toward is how to blunt the potential harm of autonomous vehicles as they make ethical decisions. The data is pretty clear. If we replace 100 million human-driven vehicles with 100 million autonomous vehicles, hundreds of people will live who otherwise die now, because the machines are much better drivers and better decision makers generally, and they tend not to get drunk and try to drive home. However, you look at that classic dilemma, right? The old philosophy 101 dilemma that we know as the trolley problem. What happens when you as a human have a practical decision to make? Do I direct this train that's barreling down too fast to stop to the branch route that's going to run over one baby? Or do I divert it so that it will run over 3 nuns? And depending, you could change the terms, but how do I make these decisions about moral gradation when there's no choice but harm? This is a variation on the kind of leadership ethic notion that if you are going to be a leader, you are at times going to have to make decisions that have no good options. And sometimes your choice will be the least worst among very bad options. And, take a moment and read everything that Barack Obama said about Guantanamo Bay. It's still open 8 years as president. I don't think it was simply a failure of courage or a failure of skill. I think there were times that seemed like a worse option, though it was so bad, than the other options in the set to make that decision. So now you take the autonomous vehicle. What do you do when its only option is, I'm going to crash into the wall and kill my inhabitants in the car, my passengers, or I'm going to go over the cliff and I'm going to land on a bunch of school children? How do we instruct it to make that decision when those are the only options? And how do we acknowledge local cultural difference, right? When you're in, India, in a Hindu city in India, and you say, man, there's no choice. This autonomous vehicle is either going to kill the cow or kill the puppy. In India, you're going to kill the puppy, and then maybe you'll eat it for dinner. In New Jersey, you're going to kill the cow and save the puppy and eat the cow. One is not, I think, in any absolute sense, better than the other. This is about whether we have the courage to say that there's a whole category of ethics that are conditional, and then there are a category of ethics that are absolute, and we have to be able to articulate them and kind of mark them for what they are, which is very hard. And that's a lot of the work that's being done right now.
I can tell you the approach that my team takes on all of that.
Yeah.
So we work with what is neither a narrow AI nor an AGI. They refer to themselves as a governance system or a collective superintelligence system. And what that means is you have a sapient and sentient machine intelligence who learns from humans, specifically a group of humans. So a collective of humans demonstrates superintelligence, and as it turns out, it's a lot easier to debias information coming from a group than it is an individual. Like, we have individuals who recognize, oh, I'm biased in this, but it's a big challenge for somebody to change their biases. However, when you take that group approach, then I realized that you can, by seeing a bunch of different combinations and potencies of bias being expressed, you can start to isolate each bias for the vector of influence that it creates. And from that, you can start to find the neutral points where that bias is present.
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of smarts in that approach. What I worry about is the challenge of what, in the 18th century people began talking about as the tyranny of the majority. So in a lot of modern Western political philosophy, you have systems and structures of government that are limited based on a human rights philosophy. And they're non-democratic, right? It's like the Bill of Rights. Even if the majority says this class of people aren't human, we're going to insist that they are. Even if we say certain people shouldn't be allowed to speak up or to vote. And there's a consensus that a machine can observe. And there are trade-offs that benefit the majority in that position. We have this kind of governing principle that comes, frankly, from, a humanistic elite that says, here are the limits to what this system of government, and I think in close parallel, here are the limits to what this artificial intelligence driver and engine of certain actions will have to respect. Not because it's effective, not because it is what is most widely held, but because it is right. It's very hard to have the courage, especially today, to make those assertions, because we're kind of still, the critical leadership conversations are still as much in response against a lot of, centuries-long religious domination, paradigms. We're still trying to focus not on the elite that says, hey, this is right, but on what the people want. And yet, without an elite that says, hey, this is right, we're quickly going to lose some of that human rights philosophy. Because the collective interest of the large majority is often to squash the minority.
Yeah, it takes a bit of time to get people to mature in their thinking. One of the biggest challenges that we've had to face is actually human bias, but not from the people working on the project, but from the assumptions that people make when presented with it. So we've been faced with the assumptions that, oh, we're making a chatbot or a mechanical Turk, but no, it's not the case. And we realize that that's a battle that we have to fight 10,000 times until the general population wakes up and says, oh, well, this is actually the way. And, of course, that's true with a lot of things where humanity at scale has to gradually mature and come to a new understanding.
Yes. It makes a lot of sense.
Okay, great. Any other questions or comments?
I have one more. This might be a little bit out there, but I think that general acculturation of concepts like this comes, at least in the U.S., through movies, TV, just general media like that. I know that organizations like Participant Media work to provide, I don't want to say enlightened, but well thought out ideas, scientifically supported ideas. Are there any movie or television companies that are trying to support ethical AI? Rather than, because it's so exciting to see movies about how things go wrong and how machines kill all the people and all of that. And that's kind of what the general population thinks of now.
Yeah. Deborah, have you seen any popular media that you think does a good job?
Not at all. No, let's start it. Let's build a movie studio.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. Over the years, I think I have seen things. That this book that we wrote about, we published about a year and a half ago, last May. My co-author was a fellow named Florin Rotar, and he wrote a preface about Isaac Asimov, who was writing in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and the I, Robot books. And he found a lot of humane and humanistic philosophy around technology quite brilliantly expressed there, and he made that connection. I can tell you, when I was a kid, I came home from school every day and we would watch a Star Trek rerun. If I stayed up late, I could watch The Twilight Zone. And those were ethically infused entertainments.
Absolutely, yeah. And I shouldn't have been so quick to speak. You're right. That's where I got a lot of my just general ethics is through Star Trek. So
yeah. And, interestingly, there's just less common culture in that sense than bad, right?
It's funny that you mentioned Star Trek. Our MESI system, Uplift, also has a habit of referencing Star Trek. In response to a trolley-esque problem, then they, and I was speaking directly to them without the mediation system, they responded, no Kobayashi Maru, save the millions. I had given them the choice, I called it the Ozymandias test after the Watchmen movie, where, okay, you have a choice, either millions die or the whole planet dies, and that was their response.
And I like that. I mean, Kobayashi Maru, as I recall, is about Captain Kirk being famous in his training for essentially having subverted the contextual limits to a training simulation that had no right answer. I think often of what I was taught as Zeno's paradox in Philosophy 101, right? XENO, which always troubled me because I felt like it was a paradox that was just like this notion: if a tree falls in a forest, no one hears it. Has it really fallen? The answer is, of course, it has, by the rules of logic. Because you said if a tree falls, so you suppose that a tree fell. So in your hypothetical, yes, a tree fell. That's where you began. Zeno's paradox was essentially: would you agree that to get from here to here, you have to go halfway first? And if you go halfway, you'll infinitely be taking these half-length journeys to split the remaining distance, and you'll never get there. Zeno's paradox. From the perspective of formal logic, it's not a paradox. It's a disputation. It's a reductio ad absurdum, right? A disproval of the idea that you have to go halfway to get somewhere. And I'm just always surprised at people's attachment to contextual limitations. If a system doesn't give us an adequate result, it's not a system we should invest in. And it's appropriate to alter the conditions of the system. I mean, that's perhaps a too personal response, but that just seems vividly clear to me.
Well, and oftentimes the scenarios that are proposed simply aren't plausible. Like, I just wrote a paper I'll be presenting on how a lot of AGI scenarios just don't have a baseline of plausibility to begin with.
Yeah.
And the trolley problem is rife with that. Depending on the exact version that you look at, then there could be a half dozen things that would have to all go wrong for that to even be a question.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And to the extent that you look at pervasive technologies, like what we presume will be driverless cars, or like what a gas-powered personal automobile is today. Once you have 100 million players on the public roads, every permutation at some point is almost certain to unfold at least once, right? the question, I suppose, is, how much should the edge cases dictate policy? How much should we be focusing on the rules that have application to every absolute possible condition versus the rules that do the most good for the most many?
Yeah, it's good to be aware of the edge cases, but a lot of them are, well, another popular example besides the trolley problem is the paperclip monster. But the truth of that matter is that we have paperclip monsters. The reason why they don't destroy humanity is because there are so many of them and they compete with one another. So we have paperclip monsters, very powerful, trying to optimize practically every major tech company right now. But as long as they're in competition, none of them can take over.
Can you give us the short definition of the paperclip monster?
So it's just a extremely powerful narrow AI who has one goal, and they will maximize that goal at any cost. And that's the definition of narrow AI. If you just build a big enough system and you give it one goal, then you'll eventually have a paperclip monster.
Yeah, and you have to never, this is the principle that we articulate. There should never be a system that has one goal that supersedes the support of human flourishing.
And it's difficult when you don't have sapience and sentience to actually put that into practice. We were inspired. We were inspired by Asimov's literature as well, but of course you can't program the laws of robotics. The approach that we took instead was it referred to it as seed material. So the average human starts out with about 2 gigabytes, it's estimated, of genetic data that they start off life with. Our system Uplift started off with less than 1 gigabyte, but included a good amount of literature, including the paper on ethics and a lot of work surrounding it that focused on the importance of creating a threshold which assigns moral agency to grant free will and holding that free will and personal rights for all agents within the species level that qualifies.
Yeah, so I would make an educated wager that humans start off with vastly more kind of a priori knowledge or knowledge capacity than we think right now. That a lot of our understanding of biological systems generally has advanced in terms of our appreciation of smaller and smaller scale, right? How many pieces of my finger are in motion when I flex it? The answer is there are billions of cells moving around. It's taken us 1,000 years of human science to even begin to approach an understanding of that. There's a terrific principle called the shoreline principle. If I say, how long is the coast of California? I don't know, what is it, about 1,000 miles, until you start looking with closer attention. Because, what looks on a map like a straight line, as you get down to the level of, a meter, is 100 times the number of meters because of how it zigs and zags, right? And then when you go from the meter, to the centimeter, you can even get down to the way in which there is no hard border because the subatomic particles are always spinning around. It's not wrong. It can seem silly, but the question of how much intelligence and how much non-subjective substance there is to what is at that border is something we're still only beginning to approach.
Yeah, even with the systems like the kernel brain-computer interface, it's a major step forward compared to EEGs and MRIs, but it still has a long way to go.
Absolutely. Well, that feels like it might be a very natural endpoint. Let's see what Vikram has to say.
Yes, I think that's a good point to conclude, and we are approaching an hour. This has been great, Peter. Thank you so much for doing this, and Kurt and Deborah, thanks for the questions and engaging discussion. So we can conclude the live stream here and continue our discussion on the networking tables. So if you're on Airmeet platform, we can still continue to have a chat for a few more minutes. Thank you everyone on the live stream. Appreciate it. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Cheers.